It's wonderful.
We are really thrilled to be able to show Tula's work. Before I go any further, I have to introduce you to one of my best, closest friends and colleagues, Bob Fishko. Bob is the director, owner of Forum Gallery in New York, one of the finest galleries you would ever want to step in the door of. And I ended that with a preposition. I wasn't, oh well. And Bob represents Tula, and we are delighted to have this opportunity. I think her paintings are, how many adjectives, words can I put together? They're really quite remarkable, aren't they? So we're going to let Tula and me a little bit, I guess, talk about them, and everybody can listen in, and perhaps you can all learn something. Nobody learns anything on a Saturday morning. So pay attention, because there is a pop quiz. All right? Okay. So Tula, welcome. We are really, by the way, I do have a hole in my sweater, just in case.
I probably have one in mind.
Mary already chastised me, and I said, what are you going to do? So welcome. We are delighted to have you here. We're delighted to have the show. I think I'll start with one of the more obvious questions. Everybody is astonished to learn that these paintings are not from direct observation, that they come more from your history and memory of looking at the earth, and then they are from your imagination.
Mm-hmm.
So
it's true.
We have to say more than that. It's true.
So I guess I could start by saying, I mean, there are so many ways to approach this. So when I started painting, I actually didn't know how to paint. I was interested in illusionism. So I was taught to be an artist by a bunch of people that did performance art or squeegee painting. They were important people in the art world, but they didn't know how to paint with a brush and oil paints, and I wanted to do that. And so I started attempting to copy what I knew to be great paintings, which was nothing. I didn't know much. And but what I did know were the most famous artists. And so I learned techniques from Caravaggio and Vermeer, and I started expanding that and actually copying it to lots of bad copies. But I did lots of copies of other artists' work, looking at the real thing, reading up as much as I could, and trying to figure out how they used materials. And then I started painting photorealistic paintings. This was in the 80s when photorealism, Richard Estes and Goings and all of the photorealists were hot. And I was just amazed that artists were like magicians. They could create illusion with pigments and brushes, which are very arcane analog materials. And so I did a lot of superrealism and photorealism, portraits, still lives, and the content started to move away from looking like traditional older paintings. Initially, I was accused by my faculty of making work that was, looked like it could have been made 300 years ago, and that I needed to make work that was relevant and contemporary. And so I decided to start making work that was fed by my imagination and my reactions to the world around me, as opposed to just looking at something and copying what I saw. And it was actually much more interesting and a lot harder to do. And that got me excited. And at that point, I was making invented still lives of industrial and man-made objects purely in environments that didn't have a sense of scale about them. So these were fragments of objects. Like, it was hard to name what the things were, but they were real, and they were textured, and they were illusionistic, and they were big. And so I was making big paintings.
Like they're not now.
Yeah, like this. They were big paintings like this. Some of them were bigger, and they were of small objects that were abstracted because of their fragmentation. And they were industrial objects. They weren't things that you would necessarily put in your house and display. And there was really dramatic light because I love Caravaggio. And they were hyper theatrical and kind of epic. And when I look at them now, or I don't have them anymore, but when I look at slides of them, um, they look like landscapes. And because of their abstraction and the space and the light. And as I continued working, I was frustrated with the fact that um, whatever you paint is nameable. If it's nameable, people have associations with it. And if you're painting still life objects, people have associations with the symbolism of those things or their own relationship to that material object and what it means. And that's powerful and it can be used well by artists who are thinking about it. But I didn't want my work to be literally about a particular war at that time. I didn't want my work to be narrative. And still life is invariably narrative at times, at least the way I was making it. So I tossed out all the still life objects and just started painting space. And I've been painting landscapes ever since. And so instead of painting images of things that are observed, I'm now making paintings of that hopefully trigger an experience in a viewer that is personal, not narrative for them, about other people's lives, but something that they can access and feel instead of having to, analyze a written paper to decode. So I'm kind of interested in the, I guess, poetics and the expression of what it means to be a human being and what it means to realize that you're going to die and how precious this world and this life is. Images that make you feel small and also make you feel excited to engage in the vastness of what's bigger than you are and to treasure every second. And I love a good challenge, and it's hard to make a painting from memory or imagination and make it look like something you could believe. So I'm still working with the fun magic of illusionism on some level, but I do really like the expressionistic quality of paint and the materiality of paint. I'm not interested in denying it anymore. My earlier paintings, you didn't know they were paintings. They had no material surface. They were thickly painted, but they were flat and photorealistic. So they look like photographs, the really early stuff. Bob, you haven't seen these paintings. And I actually really love material. It's sensual, it's magical, and to have a painting transform its identity in front of you because of your shifting proximity to it. From a distance, it looks like a photo, so maybe it's a photo, and then you get closer and you start to realize, well, this doesn't quite look right. And then when you get really close to some of these bigger paintings, you just get lost in the material and you start to forget what the picture is. And I kind of love all of the different layers of how a viewer can come to, know a painting. And I like painting, so I make paintings.
I think it's curious that there is memory involved for you, obviously.
Yeah.
And you have been most fortunate to travel the world quite a bit. Born and raised in Africa.
Not born, but raised.
Raised. And then I know that you've worked a good bit in the Arctic. You've been to the Antarctic. Tell us a little bit about how are any of these specific to a continent or a country?
Well, I guess I would say after having seen a lot of the world, most of what you see in the world, you could see somewhere else in the world. And that's magical too, that things are not exactly unique, so that there are people that will look at this and think this could be South America, but there are people that could look at this and say it is North America or it's China. And even a painting of mountains, there are mountains that look like that in Antarctica, but there are mountains that look like that in the Alps and up in Canada and also out west. And I'm kind of excited about the fact that this thing that we all sit on and live off of and take for granted. Like below our feet is the floor, and below that is the foundation, and below that is the earth. And when your feet are actually on the earth, and other people's feet are on the earth in other spots. It's like it's one organism, it's a thing. And it's without boundaries. You know, we create those fake boundaries according to nations and histories and periods of time, and obviously the invention of new systems of transportation or technology make those boundaries porous. And so we stop seeing the boundaries, you know, between tribes, between, you know, countries or even continents with bodies of water. Then suddenly you're, you know, moving around. I guess I would say that, yes, I grew up on the Ivindo River in West Central Africa in Gabon with the Pygmies, and I lived on a river that looks sort of like this, but there are places like that in other places. But my experiences in nature that make me feel like a human being, alive and inspired by what I see, inform the works. And sometimes, and I'm interested in memory, and I'm interested in losing memory, because the only archive you have of your own existence once you're dead is other people's memories of you and what you've done. And after that generation dies, you know, it's like sort of forgotten. And I'm really interested in knowing my own history. And so when I'm in a place, like all these kinds of places feel really different to me. They create new experiences for me physically. And so
You're in your studio, you're painting, but
right.
when you're in front of the canvas,
Mm-hmm.
do you sometimes feel like you're in that place? That
I know, I never feel like I'm in it, because I feel like I'm making a painting. But I'm very interested in having it get to a place where it makes me feel an emotion in the end, as opposed to just look like a painting. And so, and those emotional responses are informed, like the emotions I'm going for are things inspired by real places in nature. But sometimes some of these paintings actually, I'm trying to think of which one. So the painting above the bench in that room is a painting of what I remember to be a real place that I really knew and walked through and experienced. And I'm kind of interested in how my physical body remembers places and how that feeds how I construct a landscape or an image.
so could you tell us a little bit? Can you place some of these for us? Like you just said, this is in Africa.
All of them could sort of be in Africa, except, well, even that, but except for that. All of these places could be almost any continent. And what I like about it is that it's really hard to make something that looks plausible from nothing. And I like that challenge. It makes me God in a weird way. Like I can actually make something, because my teachers were abstract painters. And I really love abstraction. And I was raised by these people. They're kind of my artistic parents, the modernists, you know, Clement Greenberg and Helen Frankenthaler and Frank Stella. These people were people that taught me. And, you know, it was about making a picture. And there's this wonderful dance between making a picture and then making it become its own thing outside of being a picture. So that when you look at these, you're not thinking about the fact that they're things that are, you know, made on canvas and, you know, stretched over aluminum or wood or whatever they are. You're thinking about the picture and showing you, right? Like your relationship to this landscape or this nature. And I like that. I don't want people to just look at them as material objects that are called paintings that I made. I kind of want to be invisible, and I want to make the objects themselves be a vehicle for your own experiences, not mine. Does that make sense? So it's a combination of loving to just slap the paint down and make an abstraction, but that's just not enough for me. I really do need to create some idea of an illusion so that the viewer has a sense of a place. And if you can feel like you know where this is, or you know where this is because you've seen something like it, that's great. You don't need to know what I'm thinking about. I want that to be your experience in front of my work.
So tell us a little bit about your working habit. How do you begin? I mean, you have this blank canvas.
Mhm.
Do you have an idea of a particular image?
So it doesn't start just with one blank canvas. So I start out with a lot of rectangles that I design carefully in terms of their proportion. And I'm just looking at white shapes. And all those white shapes are interesting and slightly different. Like you're not even thinking about how these shapes are that different. You might look at scale as different, but if they were all painted black, you would see how different they are as material objects. Some of them are the same size, and you'll swear that this one's much taller than that one. And it's not. It's exactly the same size rectangle. And the packers actually always have problems with this because they're thinking, how many pieces of cardboard, this has to be just like that, and then they measure it, or this is totally different, and they're like, oh my God, it's exactly the same. So I start out with different shaped rectangles, my minimalism background feeding my interests. I try to keep myself animated through every step, and then I've got a bunch of rectangles around me, not just one. And I think, like, what will my show be about? Like, what is the conversation that's going to be happening with these pieces? And so each show has a different sort of idea or inspiration. And this show, actually, more than a lot of my other shows, although my work does differ from piece to piece, is incredibly varied. Like, I wanted to make landscapes in this show that were all very different kinds of approaches to nature, different kinds of dramas and intimacies and locations and palettes and textures and all of that. So I knew I wanted to do that. And so then with this show in particular, for example, I'll have a sense of like, how can I want a vast distant space that's epic. And I want to start with just the sky. What is the weather and what is the humidity that I'm thinking about as an experience? And then I'll mix up a palette and I'll lock in the sky, say in this piece. Whereas in the piece on the other side of this wall, I didn't think that way at all. I was looking at the rectangle and I wanted to make a painting that was filled with land all the way up to the top, practically where the sky was quiet. And it was all about the actual undulations of the land. And I started that by doing an underpainting in bright red. And because I had a sense that it would be a green painting and I wanted to counter, the layers of saturation. Um, I have videos. You can follow me on Instagram and like look at these pieces in progress and see how different they are. Many of them have other images underneath and other than these pictures. And I keep changing them, but I guess I would say I'm thinking about a feeling and I'm looking at the geometry of the rectangle in front of me and I'm thinking about how I don't want any piece to look like another piece. I don't want it to look like it's the same palette made like in a series. I kind of want it to look like different people painted them, so that they don't look like Monet. And they don't, like most painters paint one way, technically, and they do all their work like that and they work in series. And it's all about one idea. And so when you look at their work, it's like you can name who made that picture. And that's important. They learn one technique that they love, and then they get to do it better than anyone else. And they lean into it. But I was copying lots of different people, all these dead people that were famous artists, and I like all their techniques, and I feel like I'm entitled to appropriate everything and do anything, and why should I narrow myself down? And I used to play 9 boards of chess simultaneously, and I get bored really easily, and I like a good technical challenge, and if I made all these paintings the same way, I'd be incredibly bored. Like, I have no idea when I painted this, how this was gonna look or how it was gonna get made, this part of the river. And I decided kind of intuitively, based on some of the formal decisions, that were happening in the rest of the work, but I'm looking to make different conversations between the pieces, have them be more about landscape and humanity than about me or the way I paint.
Um,
They all start differently. They all use lots of different techniques.
we'll talk a little bit more about technique. And I heard something yesterday that a lot of the impasto, particularly the one behind me, you were using a piece of wood as a painting instrument.
You can use anything as a painting instrument. Yeah. So, I mean, one of the great things, paint is a material, and as a painter, your subject is paint, in my opinion. And you can have other subjects, but if paint isn't what you love, no one's going to want to look at it. So I like the materiality of paint and what all the different things you can do. You can cast it, you can pour it, you can freeze it, you can do lots of things with paint. And so in that painting in the foreground, I just kind of wanted to trail paint on. I tried a bunch of different surfaces, material surfaces to do that with. And I found a piece of wood that had a really nice rougher edge. It wasn't smooth like a piece of steel. And so it creates a surface. And if you get up close, like if you could touch all of these, I would say go touch them. But of course, Jerald won't let you. But when you touch them, you see like some of the dark blues and light blues in the foreground are way back underneath. They're buried under this paint, which is a metaphor for being buried under the snow, which is another metaphor for being buried. You know, and the clouds are equally material. They're really thick. You know, there's no sense that because it's a cloud, it would be vaporous like the clouds in this one. And so the white in this entire painting links it all together, and it's all very thick and painterly. So that's a different experience from the clouds in this painting. And if you look at those, they're all very like softly blended and quickly like wet on wet photorealistic approach to making a cloud, which is totally different from making it feel like a piece of concrete, like in that one. So technically, and this is a completely different painting technically than that one is. And somehow the landscapes I'm painting in my mind, what they evolved to be, sort of informs how I decide I'm going to paint them.
I also find it curious that you have several paintings going.
I had all of these going at once.
19. And so there's not a beginning to the end with one painting.
Never.
It's back and forth.
I'm working on all of them at once. I block them in. So when you first look at my studio, when I start, after I've started to put things on the rectangles, some of them have only skies and they're completely finished. Like in that painting, I did the sky in 2 hours, because if you can't do that in 2 hours, it'll never look like that. So you have to do it. You have to be prepared, and that takes time, and then you just do it because it's all wet on wet blending. So I did 2/3 of that rectangle, and it looked finished, and it looked just like that, and I haven't touched it since. And then the painting behind you, so I'm just going to look at those two paintings since we've been talking about them. I had really no idea what I was going to do. I knew what edge I wanted to create as a horizon line, and I put that in there, and I knew I wanted it to be mountains. And so I worked on the ground of the mountains. That was all painted bright green, and then I started putting black over everything. And then I started finding the dark blues. And so when you put the dark blues in over the blacks, which are over the green, remember the white isn't in that painting yet. And so what you're seeing to the where all the white is, it's black at that stage. And at this point, then I'm thinking, okay, I've got to put a sky in. So I put a very quiet, blended, like storm sky. It didn't have white puffy clouds with a blue sky. And it looked amazing. And then I put the white in on the mountains, and it just looked too photorealistic and passive. And I wanted to make the sky as physical as the ground. And so then I taped off the mountains and painted the sky differently. So then when I came back to this painting, and by the way, all these paintings are happening simultaneously. I'm making different decisions every day. And it's triage. Like I'll paint that day on the piece that's suffering the most and irritating me the most. Because I'm so like, I can't die and have this look like this. It needs to at least look like I knew what I was doing. And so in this painting, I was like really, this was one of the last paintings to get finished, and it was one of the first ones I touched because I didn't know what I wanted to do underneath it. And obviously in this painting, the sky is really the point, and the distance, the light. And so I couldn't allow the ground to like overwhelm or even come close to the distraction of what's above it, but I wanted it to enhance the distance and the light. So that became a vague kind of edited down sense of space that was almost like it was present, but it wasn't material. So you could focus on the light in the painting instead of the material of the painting, but it's still material, you know? So all of these are like that. This was a black and white painting before it was this, and they all change a lot.
How about some questions?
How long did it take you to create this 19 work?
Probably a year and a half.
So you paint consistently every day?
Pretty much.
Oh, she does a lot of other things.
You also teach.
She's chair of her art department,
Yes.
and well, chair of the
Department of Art and Art History.
Department of Art and
Yeah,
Architecture.
I'm in charge of a lot of things, but I don't do too many other things. I go out for dinners and breakfasts, and I'm a great cook, but I don't like to eat by myself. And there happen to be some fabulous restaurants around. I have some friends, so we go out and we have dinners. But short of that, I'm just working.
You play music in your studio?
I do. I tend to play, I either play music or I listen to podcasts or books on tape. But yes, the music I listen to is rock and roll.
I love rock and roll. Barbara. Oh,
Yes. Yeah.
Curious.
Towards my mortality, the horizon line, like. Yes, of course. I mean, I guess I would say that I don't want my paintings to be scary, but I want them to be awesome. I don't want them to be pretty. I want them to be beautiful. I don't want it to look like a calendar picture.
Another question. You painted objects and people early on.
Yeah, yeah. Which I miss doing sometimes.
And these paintings, at least recently, are humanity.
Yeah.
People or objects.
Right, roads and lights.
Like any existence of these are huge.
Yeah.
Massive landscapes.
Yeah. Because the earth, well, so every landscape painter, whether they want to be or not, is a political artist. And, you know, I teach in the College of the Environment as well. My background's in science, actually. So I guess I would say that my first paintings of landscape were definitely created by man. They were cultivated, there were roads, there were distant lights. Some of these have a few references to that, but mostly this is wilderness, and I'm very interested in wilderness. I grew up in the wilderness where there was no electricity, and there was no running water, there were no telephones, and there was no road. And I mean, it was just like thousands of miles of nothing except nature. And since I've been, when I travel, if I'm not going to Paris, which is nice, and other places like that, I like to go to places where the landscape is dominant and people are absent. And, you know, like when you take a walk and you take a hike, you can look at the rocks and the vegetation and get like totally absorbed in that. And you're doing that to get away from the people in the supermarkets and the roads. But I like to not look like that. I don't like hiking like that because I'm just like looking at this and I know I'm going to go back to that. When I go somewhere, I want to be in a place where no one can find me, where if something happens to me, that'll be that. Like I want to go to places where there's a risk in my survival, but there isn't because I know nearby there is a road and I know how I'm getting out. And so I love wilderness, and I think capturing and preserving a sense of that place where other people don't exist gives you this like poetic, grand experience of the earth. And it's exciting for me.
Barbara?
I'm very curious as to whether it's talking about these clouds. Whether all of this references.
No, they're in my imagination or in my experience. No, I'm not. I'm looking at a blank canvas and I'm trying to create a new landscape, literally, like a place that doesn't exist, but does. I'm trying to create an illusion because that's the fun part of painting. And if I can't do that, then I just don't want to paint. I'll do something else. So I like the alchemy and the magic of being able to fool other people by having them believe that they're looking at something that even I looked at that maybe I didn't look at. That's kind of cool. Like if you believe that the magic trick is successful, and then when you find out it's all like fabricated and invented and kind of intuitive as a process, then it's even more amazing. Like when you see how a magic trick is revealed, it's even more amazing than the actual experience of being duped. Yeah.
What is your experience of connection, if any, to theater and maybe cinematography?
Well, I love film, great films. If I,
Repeat her question, please.
oh, pardon?
Repeat her question.
What is my relationship to theater or cinematography with respect to the work? And so I have no relationship to theater other than I like Japanese 𝘊𝘰𝘧𝘧𝘦𝘦, which are these puppet performances with these very stylized and traditional puppets that are manipulated in a dark space by people you see who are master puppeteers, and you're looking at them manipulate it, and simultaneously you totally forget they're there even while you're looking at them because the puppets are so realistic and you don't know how or why. I love that. And I love the chiaroscuro of the looking of seeing that kind of performance. I love film, great film. And I love cinematography. And if I wasn't a painter, I'd probably want to be a filmmaker, but I don't like working with lots of people or having other people screw my life up or my budget up. So I'd rather just be in charge. And it's hard to be in film and be the only person making it. So, and I know nothing about how to make a film, by the way, but cinematography is all about composition and drawing your eye in and manipulating the viewer and seducing them with a palette and textures and timing. Editing is really important. And while these aren't kinetic images, my process is kinetic, and my hope is that depending on how I paint, it will slow you down or speed your experience up looking at the piece and moving along. And so in a weird way, I'm an editor as I paint, even though you don't understand why you spend more time with one piece than another. You don't need to spend the same amount of time with all these pieces to experience what I want you to experience. And so sometimes I want to speed you up and basically paint something and not give you much. Like the background of this from a distance makes you think there's a lot to look at. And then you get up close and there's like nothing to see. Whereas, in a painting like this, which seems to like graphically read well from a distance, you think there's like not much to see. You've seen it. There's a river, there's some trees, some rocks. But then when you get up close, all of the different weird techniques and processes and touching makes you look at this one longer in terms of like investigating it in a show like this, so that you're not spending the same amount of time in front of each piece in an exhibition. But then when you put it in your home and you look at it, it should be able to transport you forever. But in terms of looking at them in relation to each other, they're all doing different things. So cinema is important to me.
More questions?
Can you talk about your
Susan.
titles?
My titles, yes, thank you.
They're fun and they're curious and they're open.
I can't understand them.
No? Well, can I get,
You want one of these?
two things. Oh, that's great. And I'm gonna get this, sorry.
By the way, we have proudly published a catalog to document the exhibition.
Thank you.
There is one gratis for all of you today, so make sure that you get one. And additionally, there's a major monograph on Tula, and there are 2 or 3 of those here as well. So
Thank you.
looks like she's going to quote herself.
No, I'm not. I'm never going to do that, but I'm going to read some titles, since not all of you know perhaps what is being discussed. So when I first started making paintings, I didn't want to title them like Sunset or Landscape Number 3 or the Appalachian Trail or whatever, because they weren't real places. And also that just seemed like unimaginative. So because I was trained by a bunch of modernists in a postmodern art world, I was dealing with different camps of painters, people who didn't like realism and people who didn't like abstraction. And they were all painters and artists, and they didn't like each other, they didn't respect each other. And I thought this was ridiculous. Like, painting is fun, like we can do it all, and I could do it all. So I decided initially to make my first titles for my first landscapes to be critiques of the narrow-mindedness of the art world. And also the narrow-mindedness of artists and the way they look at art. So, and also trying to let them know that there are other ways to see. So I'll read you a series of those titles. So defining the precise nature of space turns this into like This is my task, as opposed to this is what this picture is of. Pleasure does not readily surrender to analysis, right? The importance of contrasts, parallels between narrative and spatial sequences, the discourse of pleasure, another term of the equation, the elements of order, a standard model for plotting variations, cast as elements alone and cool progressions. So for me, these titles had to do with what I was thinking I was reacting to in the art world. So on some level, there is a reaction to the art world going on in all of this. But then, as time went by and I got really older and I turned 50, I was like, fuck this. I am going to just do what I want. I'm a romantic person. These are romantic paintings. I'm not the cynical person that I seem to be in the first titles. So now I have like the structured depth of meaning and desire, the contemporary sublime. Encoding will help recognition. The past is pressed up against the present. Wilderness does not locate itself. An agent of seduction, built exclusively for delight, the scandal of pleasure, the essential elements of romanticism, decisions based on intuitions, because that's how I work. So now my titles, and you should look at the titles because they're fun.
Do the titles, is there any direct link between a title and a particular painting?
Yes, absolutely. Every single one of those titles goes to a particular painting. For me, no one maybe knows that, but this is what I'm thinking about as I'm doing that particular painting. And so the way it starts is I create on index cards phrases, and I also appropriate phrases from other people's books. Like, I love Bernard Tschumy's Architecture and Disjunction. He teaches at Columbia Architecture. And like any, great writers. And some of them have like interesting phrasing. And so I'll sometimes appropriate a phrase, but I'll create phrases. And then I look at these things and I'll place them like the index cards under the paintings and live with them for a while before I decide, and then I'll edit them. But yeah, they're particular.
More questions?
Yeah.
Andrew.
Just looking at your
Keep us going. I'll be right back.
Pardon?
you have so much facility.
Thank you. I hope so.
And I hear you talk about them too. It sounds like it's almost like they paint themselves. But
Yes.
are there areas of struggle, like at times, or like where you're, I don't know, like areas where you get hung up or struggle?
Totally. Absolutely. Yeah.
Can you talk maybe?
Sure. I think that the areas of struggle aren't about the fact that I don't know how to draw or paint. They have to do with like creating the rectangle so it works compositionally, or making sure that the mood works. And so the reason why these paintings change a lot is because, well, some of them will change a lot because the image underneath doesn't evoke the feeling I want. So I'll repaint it with a different thing. And that's, to me, is a struggle. It's a struggle to get them to look like definitive ideas, every one of them, even though the painting process is simple. And so I didn't struggle with that painting. Technically, this took a lot of layers. And so this was more of a struggle, if you call it that. The painting in there, that painting represents the biggest struggle in this whole world of images that I've created for the show. And you can see underneath it the archive of very evidently another painting. And it had more texture in it. And then when I lowered the horizon line to create the drama of the sky, I wanted the sky to feel blended like this. But suddenly I had this like terrain of this other painting underneath it that was all gnarly. So in that sky, you see, you know, the creamy blend over this gnarly archive of, you know, a different decision. And I wasn't sure if I could show that. And then I thought, that's what my process is. So I think part of it is just getting used to allowing myself to do whatever I want and not be ashamed of, you know, decisions that I feel like I need to edit. And editing doesn't mean it's a mistake. It just means that it's not exactly as effective or quite what you want. And so you need to change something to make it more effective. And I guess that could look like a mistake, but like to a photorealist painter, which I was, that was a mistake. Like that's really bad and unacceptable. And a part of me is like celebrating the fact that I can do all these different things on one surface and not apologize for it. But if it happened in that painting, I wouldn't show it because that painting should be easy and non-material. But that one became a gnarly, textured space, so it was okay. But I struggle. You have no idea. Yeah.
I'm wondering if the struggle is because you're so clear about what you want to achieve. Not like the image is forming you. It sounds like
You know what? I don't. The thing I have clear in mind is the feeling. But it's hard to paint a feeling, and it's hard to make an image that triggers that feeling. So I would say every great filmmaker has an agenda. And of course, they can't screw up a lot because of the money and the time and the people. But I screw up a lot. And that is that I have a feeling, but I don't have a script. And I'm not looking at anything. And so now I have to create that feeling. And I have to maintain my awareness of that feeling for that piece and find a language that will create it. And so I guess for me, the struggle is I have this abstract idea that's emotional and poetic, and I have to make a material object that elicits that feeling without looking at anything. That's hard to do. And so that's my struggle. And I like that struggle because that's like the struggle for joy and poetics in your own life, which comes very easily at times, and at other times, like you can decide to do this, but will it prevent you from getting there? Like how do you make decisions and how do you allow your intuition to guide you at the same time? So these are all very intuitive, but I'm a very logical person. And so I've got these two skill sets kind of hopefully helping each other. Maybe sometimes, the logic gets in the way of the intuition too much and vice versa. There are paintings that are more intuitive and paintings that are more logical. Like that one was really logical and it looks like it, even though it's poetic. And some of them, like this, is really intuitive. And, you can tell, I think.
Can I ask you something a little more intimate about the
Sure.
mental process for you?
Yeah.
You mentioned laying out rectangles.
Yes.
Do you piece them together like a grid and then work each piece into painting? Do you do a grid? Do you do a drawing? Do you just paint?
That's a great question. I do nothing. I paint on white surfaces
Just
with
start.
paint, with oil paint.
And you just begin.
I have no clue. Like I mix my colors for that and I just painted that with nothing. But then sometimes I'll use line and I'll paint line. In other paintings, I'll do tonal shapes, but I don't know what they're going to be. I'm basically dividing the rectangle and trying to get to a place of feeling. And when you have 19 paintings in front of you that aren't paintings yet, and you want each one to elicit something else, but they all need to talk to each other and not quote each other, you're just like, it's intense. It's like you're awake and you're dancing around. And so each one starts really differently. And it's kind of really fun to watch. When I go into the studio for each body of work, it's a different kind of experience because they all start differently. It's like different kids and they all have different like weird tics. And like, you're looking at them, one of them's doing this and the other one's doing this, and you need to react to these things and make it work. Yeah, exactly. It really feels like that. And I like that. Yes.
Can you talk about the way that you use lighting?
Great idea. So sometimes I use it and sometimes I don't. Do you notice that?
The use of light.
Yeah. Yeah. So sometimes I do things, lighting is important. Lighting is drama. Lighting reveals, contrast. Lighting is structurally it fills content, like how something is lit creates a mood, right? Shadows are really interesting to me, places where definition is ambiguous. But I also like bright light that hurts your eyes, as well. Sometimes those two things will find themselves in one piece. Sometimes they won't. So, for example, in that painting, the shadows, I keep going back to that because I'm looking at it, the shadows on the shadow side of the mountains are all completely wrong and they're all the same color and it's completely flat on purpose. And yet you believe it's a shadow because it's darker than everything that's white. And by the way, all the whites are the same color too, which is like completely flat. And so that is creating an idea of light without actually depicting it. Then in a painting like this, while you think there's a light source, because there's one in the sky and there's one on part of the edge of the mountain, it really is pretty flat. There isn't really an accurate light source in this painting. You look at this painting and you have no idea what the light source is, like where it is and what's going on. And it's true of all of them. Like, this is impossible, right? And I like that because I made it up. So I do want them to be a bit impossible. And I know this is weird. This is probably the weirdest picture besides the volcano painting in here. But there's something really wonderful about having disjointed depictions of light in a rectangle too. And so each one of them is like really different. Like, that's more conventional. And sometimes, like, if you take black and white pictures of these pictures, they're gray. And I love that. I love like working with values that are close in value to define volume as opposed to using high and low key values. And so some of them are really gray and some of them are really high contrasty when you shoot them in black and white. And I take photos of the work at the end of every day that I work on it, and I turn those photos into black and white to see how they look different and where I want to push them or flatten them out in terms of their values. But light is dramatic, it's seductive, it's emotional, right? And it's so important.
Because I've been watching these paintings
Yeah.
so much that the foreground actually is changing also.
Yes, it is. It is. Exactly. But it's not even accurate. At this point, I was just like, I need lots of texture that's super abstract that we say is rocks, because there's lots of texture that's super abstract. And all of these purple, this is purple, all these purple colors that are the highlights are only one color, but because the color of what's in the darker glazed area underneath changes, it changes the way you see the color in the highlights. So I don't have to do all that work necessarily. In some paintings, I do all that work.
Tula will be here for a little while. Everybody, please take opportunity to speak with her and ask her some more questions. And Tula, thank you for being here very
Thank
much.
you. Thank you.
Thank you for everyone who
Thank you so much for coming, everyone. Thank you. Thank you for great questions, and I can answer them. And I will also tell you that each one of these paintings is a portrait of someone